Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back almost 2,000 years to ancient Rome. But we're not going to hang out in marble palaces, or stroll through the Senate with a toga-wearing politician, or even watch gladiators bash each other's skulls in at the Colosseum. No, tonight we're going to a place far more ordinary, far less glamorous, and, honestly, far more relatable, the Roman apartment block. The Insula, which literally just means island, because from the street they look like big stone islands rising up among the narrow alleys. And if you're picturing a cozy little apartment with air conditioning, private bathrooms, and a nice balcony, let me stop you right there. These things were more like the original nightmare rentals. Overcrowded, noisy, dirty, and occasionally collapsing without warning. Think of your least favorite apartment complex, take away electricity, plumbing, and basic safety standards, then multiply by 5 stories. Congratulations! You're imagining an insula. But this is where the majority of Romans lived. Not in villas with columns and fountains, not in sprawling country estates, but in cramped apartments stacked on top of one another. Rome was massive, over 1 million people at its peak, and they all had to live somewhere. Villas were for the rich, insulae were for everyone else. And by everyone else, I mean the overwhelming majority. If you were a baker, a barber, a shopkeeper, a clerk, or just a poor soul trying to scrape by, you lived in one of these giant tenements. And if you were really unlucky, you lived on the upper floors, which meant not only were you climbing endless flights of rickety stairs every day, but you also had the worst water access, the draftiest rooms, and the highest chance of your ceiling coming down on your head. So basically, congratulations, you paid less rent. An insula usually rose 4 or 5 stories high, sometimes more, though the city technically had building codes to limit the height. Emphasis on technically, because Roman landlords were, shockingly, just as greedy as modern ones. If they could squeeze in another floor, they did. The ground floor usually had shops opening directly onto the street, bakeries, taverns, little stalls selling wine or olives. Above that, the better apartments, larger rooms, sturdier walls, sometimes even with their own water supply. Then, as you climbed higher, things got worse. Smaller rooms, thinner walls, fewer amenities. By the top floor, you were basically living in a wooden attic, hot in summer, freezing in winter, with a view that was mostly rooftops and smoke. The Romans even had a saying that the higher up you lived, the poorer you were. And unlike today, no elevator, just stairs. Endless, creaking stairs. If you lived on the 5th floor, you really had to want to go outside. Now, let's imagine a day inside one of these insulae. Morning comes, and the streets below are already alive. Vendors shout, carts rattle over cobblestones, someone's arguing in Latin about stolen vegetables, and down the street a baker is hauling out the first loaves from his oven. Inside your insula, you hear everything. The walls are thin, the windows small, and privacy is basically non-existent. You hear your neighbor on one side complaining, the neighbor on the other side snoring, and above you, someone dumping a bucket of wastewater out the window. Hopefully not while you were passing underneath, though that was always a risk. Romans had a charming tradition of tossing their chamber pots directly into the street, usually with a shout of warning, which may or may not have given you enough time to dodge. You lived in a city of 1 million people without plumbing on the upper floors. Things got messy. Food was another challenge. If you lived on the ground or maybe 1st floor, you might have a little hearth for cooking. If you lived higher up, fire regulations often forbade open flames, because nothing ruins a city faster than one insula catching fire and setting off a chain reaction. Which, of course, still happened. Rome burned often, and insulae were prime fuel. So if you didn't have a hearth, you either went downstairs to buy hot food from a vendor, or you ate cold. In fact, many Romans didn't bother cooking at all, relying instead on little pop-up taverns, street stalls, and bakeries. Which means Roman insulae were noisy not just with neighbors, but with the constant traffic of people coming and going, eating and drinking at all hours. Imagine living above a 24/7 kebab shop, convenient, but also loud and smelly. And then there was water. The famous Roman aqueducts brought water into the city. Yes, but don't imagine pipes leading straight into your 5th floor walk-up. If you lived high, you carried your own water, bucket by bucket, up every flight. Or you paid some poor soul to do it for you. And water wasn't just for drinking. You needed it for washing, cooking, and trying desperately to keep your one-room flat from smelling like a stable. Bathhouses existed, of course, but you weren't visiting them daily unless you had money to spare. So, for many Romans, living in an insula meant an ongoing negotiation with filth. You cleaned what you could, you ignored what you couldn't, and you prayed your ceiling wouldn't leak too badly when it rained. But for all their problems, insulae were also communities. People knew their neighbors, sometimes too well. Families crammed into one room, children played in stairwells, laundry hung across alleys like a tangled canopy. You borrowed oil from the woman next door, you gossiped with the man downstairs, you shared complaints about the landlord with everyone. And the landlord, of course, was often an absentee rich man who owned half the block and barely cared if the roof caved in, as long as the rent kept coming. Some insulae were maintained decently, but many were not. Collapses happened often enough that they became clichés in Roman literature. Poets joked about the hazards of renting cheap rooms, satirists compared landlords to vultures. If you think your apartment management is bad now, try writing to one in Latin about how your ceiling just fell on your bed. So, as you settle deeper into this picture, imagine yourself lying on a straw mattress in a one-room flat, the sounds of the city drifting in through the window, the smell of bread and smoke in the air, your neighbor's voice rising through the wall. It's crowded, noisy, sometimes dangerous, but it's also alive. This was the reality for most Romans, the forgotten backdrop of the empire. Not marble halls, not golden statues, but stacked apartments filled with ordinary people trying to get through another day. And as the hours slip by, the insula keeps standing, creaking, breathing, housing thousands of lives in its uneven walls. So, let's settle in for another day inside the insula. Morning comes, and if you thought the city was quiet while you were still half asleep on your straw mattress, you were wrong. Rome never really did quiet. The streets below are already filling before the sun is properly up. Vendors are shouting, donkeys are braying, wheels are squeaking over cobblestones, and someone is already arguing about prices. You hear it all because your walls are thin, and even if they weren't, your window is basically a hole in the wall covered with a wooden shutter that doesn't fit properly. Sound insulation was not a Roman innovation. You wake up whether you want to or not, because the city is awake, and if you're not moving, someone else is. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is not going to blow your mind. Maybe some bread left over from yesterday, dipped in watered-down wine if you're lucky. Romans weren't big on breakfast as a meal. Most people just grabbed something small before heading out. If you're really hungry, you might pop downstairs to buy a warm roll or some porridge from a street seller. It's cheap, it's filling, and it saves you from setting anything on fire in your apartment. Because remember, if you live high up, you don't cook. Open flames were banned in the upper stories for obvious reasons. Nobody wanted the whole building to burn down because you fancied a fried egg. The ground floor, though, that's where the food really happens. The bakery on the corner is already smoking from its oven. Next to it, a tavern has barrels rolled out, serving wine to men who apparently think it's never too early for a drink. The little stalls are selling figs, olives, nuts, and whatever else is in season. You can't escape the smell of cooking, or the constant shuffle of feet going in and out of the shops. Imagine living above a permanent food court, where you get all the noise and all the smells, but none of the free samples. That's insular life. The day passes in layers of sound. From inside your room, you hear the shuffle of neighbors going up and down the stairs, the occasional creak that makes you wonder if the beams are really as sturdy as they should be, and always, the street noise below. Romans had laws against carts moving through the city during the day, to keep traffic under control, but enforcement was spotty, and anyway, there was still plenty of chaos without them. Hawkers shouted, beggars begged, children played in alleys, dogs barked at everything. Privacy didn't exist. Your life was lived in public, even when you were technically indoors. Water is another part of the daily grind. If you live on the lower floors, you might have access to a pipe from the aqueducts, maybe even a shared cistern in the courtyard. If you live higher, tough luck. You haul water yourself, bucket after bucket, up every flight of stairs. Or, if you've got a little coin, you pay a porter to do it for you. Either way, water is precious. You don't waste it. You wash sparingly, you reuse what you can, and you save your proper bathing for a trip to the public baths, where the water is hot, the floors are crowded, and the gossip is free. Your insula isn't giving you a hot shower. At best, it's giving you a cold splash in a bucket. As midday comes, the sun beats down on the rooftops, and the upper floors of the insula become ovens. Heat rises, and Roman construction wasn't built for comfort. If you're unlucky enough to live on the top floor, you spend your summers sweating and your winters shivering, all for the privilege of paying slightly less rent. And as you sit in your stuffy little room, you can hear the tavern downstairs filling with voices, men shouting over dice games, someone singing badly, someone else breaking a jug. The whole building vibrates with life, every sound magnified by thin walls and stone courtyards. You don't need to leave to know what's happening outside. It comes right through your walls. Evening brings its own rhythm. Taverns get louder, the street fills with lamplight, and neighbors crowd into stairwells or rooftops to talk. Families sit down to meals, bread, cheese, lentils, maybe some vegetables if they could afford them, meat if they were really lucky. The richer tenants on the lower floors might dine on something fancier, brought home from the market or bought from a cookshop. The poorer tenants higher up probably ate whatever was cheap and filling. But everyone heard each other's meals, smelled each other's stews, and sometimes shared. The insula was a place of constant overlap, lives pressed together in ways that were both comforting and suffocating. Of course, evenings were also when danger lurked. Oil lamps flickered, shadows stretched, and fire was always a threat. A dropped lamp, a careless ember, and the whole insula could go up. Fires spread fast in Rome, leaping from one wooden beam to the next, from one insula to another. The city had fire brigades, but they weren't always quick, and they weren't always effective. Everyone who lived in an insula knew the fear of hearing a shout outside, the rush of footsteps, the rising smell of smoke. Collapses were another risk. Poor construction, over-ambitious landlords adding one floor too many, walls that bowed under the strain. You could go to bed one night and wake up under rubble the next. Living in an insula was always a gamble, but it was a gamble most Romans had no choice but to take. And yet, life went on. Children grew up playing in the courtyards, families gathered in stairwells, neighbors leaned out windows to chat, and the insula became more than just a building. It was a community, chaotic and fragile, but full of connection. People made do, because people always do. And as the night deepens, the noise fades just enough for sleep, though never completely. There's always one tavern still open, one drunk singing his way home, one dog barking in the alley. You close your eyes, the beams creak above you, the street hums below you, and you drift off in the uneasy, restless sleep of a Roman tenant. If you really want to understand a Roman insula, you have to start by looking at the way it stacked people. Not just physically, though that part is obvious, but socially too. Because the insula was a miniature version of Roman society itself, layered from top to bottom, each floor a rung on the ladder of class. Down below, closest to the street, were the tenants who could afford the better spaces. Bigger rooms, sturdier walls, sometimes even access to water pipes. Maybe a private latrine if the landlord was feeling generous, though private is a flexible word when a dozen other people might be sharing the same one. These were the respectable lower middle class Romans, shopkeepers, artisans, clerks, small business owners. People who weren't rich enough for a villa, but rich enough to pay extra for not having to hike up 4 flights of stairs every time they wanted a drink of water. Go up a floor or two, and the apartments shrink. The walls get thinner, the ceilings lower, the windows smaller. Here you find laborious, petty traders, maybe a struggling craftsman with too many children and not enough income. Rooms are crowded, families spill into each other, and privacy is even more of a joke than it was downstairs. Go higher still, and conditions deteriorate further. By the time you reach the top, you're in the realm of the very poor, the renters of last resort. Cramped wooden attics, drafty and dangerous, hot in summer, freezing in winter, with no water and no facilities. Rent was cheapest up here for a reason. The higher you lived, the poorer you were, and the greater your chances of being the first to die if the building collapsed. It was Roman trickle-down economics in the most literal sense. And of course, the irony didn't escape anyone. Richer tenants lived closer to the ground, where things were stable and convenient. Poorer tenants lived high above them, in conditions that were more dangerous, more exhausting, and harder to endure. Today we think of penthouses as luxury, with sweeping views of the city. In Rome, a penthouse was a fire trap. Nobody bragged about their top-floor apartment. They complained about it. They cursed the endless stairs. They hated hauling water. And they eyed the beams above their heads nervously every time they creaked. Living high up in an insula wasn't glamorous, it was punishment. But what made it more interesting was that all these layers lived right on top of one another. The baker on the ground floor, with his oven heating the street, might be only one floor below a clerk's family trying to raise children in 2 small rooms, who in turn were only one floor below a group of laborists sharing a space so crowded you couldn't stretch your legs without kicking someone. Everyone heard everyone else. Arguments, singing, crying babies, footsteps, buckets clattering up and down the stairs. It was impossible not to. And so an insula became its own society, crammed into a single building. Neighbors might hate each other, but they also relied on one another. If your neighbor upstairs dropped a bucket of water, it might save you from hauling one yourself. If the guy downstairs ran a tavern, it meant hot food was always near. If the woman next door baked bread, maybe she'd give you some crusts for your children. You lived cheek by jowl, and you survived together, even when you annoyed each other endlessly. The landlords, of course, hovered above it all, not physically, but socially. Many of them didn't live in the building at all. They were wealthy men, senators, knights, merchants, who owned whole blocks of insulae and rented them out. They collected their rent through agents, rarely concerned with the details of upkeep, which meant the tenants were on their own when walls cracked, stairs broke, or the roof leaked. Roman poets loved to complain about this. Juvenal, Martial, and others joked about landlords who ignored collapsing buildings while demanding rent anyway. It became a cliché. Insulae were always falling down, always catching fire, and the landlords were always rich enough not to care. Sound familiar? Yes, the original slumlords were alive and thriving in ancient Rome. And yet, the insula was essential. Without them, the city couldn't function. They were the only way to pack 1 million people into the narrow footprint of Rome. Villas and domus houses were for the elite, sprawling and wasteful, but the insula was for everyone else, the backbone of the city. And if they were dangerous, well, that was the price of living in the empire's capital. Everyone knew it, everyone joked about it, but everyone still lived in them. Rome's energy came from those crowded stairwells, those noisy courtyards, those endless layers of people crammed into too little space. So imagine again climbing the stairs of one of these insulae. You pass the ground floor shops, hot and crowded, the smell of bread and smoke hitting your nose. On the first floor, a family of artisans is sitting down to lunch, their windows just above street level, their voices drifting out to passers-by. On the second floor, a clerk's wife is yelling at her children to stop fighting. On the third, laborists are collapsing on their mats after a long morning hauling stone. By the time you reach the top, the rooms are smaller, the ceilings lower, and the tenants wear the tired, resigned faces of people who know they're paying the lowest rent but still somehow too much. Each floor is a world of its own, and yet they all blend into one another, stitched together by creaking beams and shared staircases. And at night, when the torches flicker in the street and shadows dance across the walls, the insula becomes a single organism. Families whisper through thin partitions, tavern songs drift upward, someone snores, someone cries, and above it all, the wooden beams groan softly. A fragile building, stacked with fragile lives, layered from rich to poor, top to bottom. A Roman society in miniature, one that could fall apart at any moment, but which somehow held together, night after night. If you really want to picture what life inside an insula felt like, you can't just think about walls and stairs and rooms. You have to imagine the sensory world of it, the sounds, the smells, the little irritations that never stopped. Because an insula wasn't just a place to live, it was a constant performance of daily life bleeding into your space whether you liked it or not. First, the sounds. The walls were thin, and the floors thinner. You heard everything your neighbors did, whether you wanted to or not. The family next door fighting, the children crying, the couple above you arguing, the guy downstairs hammering at his workshop. The sound of footsteps up and down the stairs was constant, like the heartbeat of the building. Carts rattled on the street below, dogs barked, vendors shouted, and somewhere in the distance, a drunk sang badly. Silence was not part of insular life. Even when the city slept, the building creaked, beams groaned, water dripped, and rats scurried. You lived in a world of noise, always. And then the smells. Oh yes, the smells. Forget about the fantasy of Rome as marble and roses. An insula smelled like people, animals, food, and waste, all crammed together. On one floor, someone was cooking lentils, on another someone was frying fish, and all of it drifted into your room whether you were hungry or not. Add to that the smell of damp straw mattresses, the smoke of oil lamps, the tang of unwashed bodies, and the occasional whiff of chamber pots being emptied out the window. Streets doubled as sews, alleys as latrines, and if you happened to walk below at the wrong time, well, the Romans had a habit of shouting heads up before tossing waste, but let's just say it was more of a courtesy than a guarantee. Living in an insula meant you carried the city's smell with you at all times, whether you wanted to or not. Heat was another constant companion. In summer, the upper floors turned into ovens. Airflow was minimal, the walls trapped warmth, and you baked in your little box while the sun beat down on the roof. In winter, the opposite problem. Drafts crept in through shutters, walls leaked cold, and the thin blankets did very little. Fires helped, but only if you lived low enough to have one legally, and even then, you lived with the knowledge that one stray spark could bring the whole block down. It's no wonder Rome burned so often. Insulae were firewood disguised as homes. People kept buckets of water nearby, but once flames caught, there wasn't much you could do. A few years later, the ashes were swept away, and the landlord rebuilt, usually taller and cheaper, because why not double down on a bad idea? And collapses, oh, collapses were a regular feature. Landlords wanted to squeeze as many tenants in as possible, and construction often cut corners. Wooden beams sagged, walls leaned, and sometimes entire buildings simply crumbled. Roman satirists loved to joke about tenants crushed under falling plaster or ceilings giving way at night. The city even had regulations about maximum heights, but landlords ignored them, bribed officials, or just built anyway. The result was predictable: sudden disasters. You went to bed and didn't wake up, not because of enemies or war, but because your apartment building gave up on being a building. It was so common that wealthy Romans mocked city dwellers for their bad luck, while they enjoyed their villas with sturdy walls and gardens. Still, people lived there, because they had to. Rome's population was enormous, and insulae were the only way to cram 1 million people into the city. You accepted the noise, the smells, the fire hazards, because what was the alternative? A hovel in the countryside? For many, the insula was the best they could afford. And life inside was not only hardship. There was also a vibrancy to it. The constant chatter, the smells of cooking, the children running through stairwells, it made the city feel alive. You were never alone, even when you wanted to be. Life spilled into every crack of the building. It was exhausting, but it was also community. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it: the distant clang of a blacksmith, the laughter of children, the creak of stairs, the drip of water, the sudden shout as someone dumps a bucket into the street. You can almost smell it too: bread baking, oil frying, smoke rising, waste lingering. It's not glamorous, it's not pleasant, but it's real. That was the insula: messy, crowded, dangerous, and yet essential, a beating heart of the Roman city. You lived there because you had no choice, and somehow, in the cracks between noise and filth, you found a way to build a life. When you think about living in an insula, it wasn't just about surviving the noise, the smells, and the constant fear of collapse. It was also about the grind of daily life, the endless little routines that carried people from dawn to dusk, year after year. Because most tenants weren't philosophers pondering the meaning of existence, they were ordinary Romans trying to get by, and their days were consumed by work, food, sleep, and whatever scraps of leisure they could squeeze into the cracks. Work, of course, depended on who you were and where you lived in the building. A shopkeeper on the ground floor might run his business out of the same room he slept in, rolling open the shutters in the morning to sell bread, wine, or whatever goods he had. His family cooked in the back, ate in the corner, and slept on mats rolled up when the shop reopened. The insula was never just a home. It was a workshop, a tavern, a stall, a place of constant activity. The sound of hammers, the smell of bread, the clatter of dice in a gambling corner, all of it happened inside these walls, bleeding upward into the rooms above. For the tenants on higher floors, work usually meant leaving the insula altogether. You might be a laborer heading out to haul stone, a porter carrying goods across the city, a clerk hurrying to an office in the forum, or a servant working in someone else's domus. You locked your single room, such as it was, and carried your day with you, returning only when the sun dipped low. And returning meant climbing those endless stairs again, arms full of whatever you had managed to earn, your legs already aching from the streets. The Insula was both your refuge and your burden, a place that gave you shelter but demanded energy every time you returned. Food was another constant struggle. Without proper kitchens, most people relied on street vendors and taverns. The smell of frying fish, roasting meat, or stewing lentils drifted through the alleys, and for a few coins you could fill your stomach without lighting a fire that might bring the building down. Wealthier tenants on the lower floors might have small hearths, where they cooked stews or baked flatbreads, but even they often preferred to buy ready-made meals. Cooking was expensive, time-consuming, and dangerous. Why risk burning down your home when you could grab a bowl of chickpeas or a loaf of bread just downstairs? And so the Insula thrummed with the constant traffic of people going in and out, eating and drinking at all hours, keeping taverns and food stalls alive. Sleep, when it came, was rarely peaceful. Families crammed into one room, children crying, neighbors fighting, tavern songs echoing up the stairwell. Privacy was almost non-existent. You lay on your straw mattress, listening to the couple next door argue, the dog bark in the street, and the steady drip of water from the roof. Sometimes you fell asleep, sometimes you didn't. But either way, the building never truly rested. Fires burned in the night, footsteps creaked on the stairs, and the city kept humming. Even dreams were noisy in an insula. And yet, amid all this chaos, people carved out little spaces of leisure. Children played in the courtyards, their shouts echoing up the stairwells. Neighbors leaned out of windows to gossip across narrow alleys. Men gathered in taverns to drink, throw dice, and shout at each other, their laughter and curses rising into the night. Women fetched water together, sharing news and complaints. Life wasn't all drudgery. It was crowded, messy, and often dangerous, but it was also vibrant. The Insula was alive in a way that villas never were. In villas, the rich had silence, gardens, fountains. In insulae, the poor had noise, neighbors, and the pulse of the city. Different worlds, stacked side by side, yet both part of Rome. It was a world of compromises. You accepted cramped rooms because you couldn't afford space. You accepted endless noise because silence was impossible. You accepted risk because there was no alternative. But you also built connections. The Insula was a community of strangers forced together, learning to live in one another's pockets. And in that community, there was resilience. Even when the walls cracked and the roof leaked, even when the fires burned and the landlords ignored the damage, people adapted. They always do. Rome's million-strong population was not built on villas and marble. It was built on these fragile towers, stacked high with lives, creaking under the weight of a city that never slept. So as night settles again, picture the Insula quieting, though never truly silent. Lamps flicker, children doze, neighbors murmur through thin walls. A tavern door slams, footsteps echo on the stairs, a dog barks in the alley. The beams above your head creak, the straw mattress rustles, and you drift into uneasy rest. Tomorrow the routine begins again, the same grind of work, food, water, gossip, noise, and sleep. Life inside a Roman insula was never easy, never glamorous, but it was the heartbeat of the empire, crowded and imperfect, yet endlessly alive. So now, as we climb once more through the stairwells of the Roman insula, creaking boards underfoot, walls thin as parchment, voices spilling through every crack, it's worth pausing to remember what these buildings really meant. They weren't just architecture. They were Rome itself, in miniature. When we picture the Roman Empire, we usually think of marble columns, aqueducts marching across valleys, senators wrapped in togas, or emperors strutting in golden armor. But the truth is that most Romans never touched any of that. Their Rome was an insula. Their Rome was 4 or 5 stories of stacked families, wooden beams, bucket water, chamber pots, gossip, smoke, and risk. Their Rome was a single crowded room with a straw mattress and a window that rattled when the wind blew. That was the real empire. 1 million people packed into a city, most of them clinging to lives inside these fragile, teetering blocks. And yet, for all their danger and discomfort, Insulae made Rome possible. Without them, the city could not have held its vast population. Without them, the baker couldn't have lived above his shop, The laborer couldn't have returned home after hauling stone. The clerk couldn't have raised his children in shouting distance of the forum. The insula was a compromise, a dangerous one, but it was also a solution. It stacked lives like clay jars, fragile and overlapping, but it worked. Rome lived because the insula lived. And so even when they collapsed, even when they burned, they were rebuilt. Because they had to be. There was no other way to house the empire's beating heart. The irony, of course, is that the people who lived in them rarely celebrated them. Roman poets mocked insulae as death traps, tenants cursed their landlords, neighbors gossiped about leaks and fires. And yet, in their complaints, you can hear the resilience too. People joked about their own hardships, made light of their cramped spaces, and carried on. Because that's what humans do. We adapt, even to discomfort. We turn squalor into normality, danger into background noise. And in doing so, we keep living, even when the beams creak and the roof leaks. The insula was not a palace, but it was home, and home is enough, even when it shakes in the wind. And so, if you close your eyes now, you can almost place yourself inside one. The smell of bread from the bakery downstairs drifts into your little room. A child laughs somewhere in the stairwell. A dog barks outside. Your neighbor mutters, your ceiling groans, footsteps pass on the boards above. The walls are thin, the air is close, but it is alive with the hum of thousands of lives pressed together. The empire outside might be conquering lands and building monuments, but here, in this fragile block of stone and wood, Rome's real story is unfolding. Ordinary people, carrying buckets, sharing gossip, cooking lentils, scolding children, rolling dice in taverns, crawling into straw beds at the end of long days. This is the Rome that rarely makes it into marble statues and triumphal arches. This is the Rome of noise, smoke, neighbors, and endless compromise. And as the night falls, the insula quiets, though never completely. A few voices still murmur through the walls, a tavern song drifts up faintly, a baby cries somewhere, then settles. The beams above sigh as if exhausted too. You lie back on your mattress, the straw rustling under you, and feel the steady pulse of life around you. Imperfect, fragile, crowded, but enduring. The insula holds you, as it held generations before you, stacked high with stories, stacked high with lives. Tomorrow it will wake again, noisy and restless. But for now, it drifts into uneasy sleep, and so do you. So let's leave Rome here tonight, in the hum of an insula, in the glow of oil lamps, in the chatter of neighbors and the creak of stairs. Forget the emperors. Forget the marble. This is the Rome that mattered to most, the Rome of crowded apartments, stubborn resilience, and fragile walls. And as you breathe slowly, as your eyes grow heavier, let that world fade softly into the distance. A city alive with noise, wrapped in darkness, waiting for the next day to begin again. And just like that, this story closes, but our journey isn't over. The past is full of hidden corners, and the next one is waiting just ahead. Let's lean in and drift into something new. This is Medieval Timekeepers, how people tell time before clocks. Life started when the sun decided it was time. No alarms, no calendars filled with meetings, just sunlight creeping into your little hut and the neighborhood rooster screaming like the feathery alarm clock he was born to be. In summer, that meant an unreasonably early start, the kind of dawn that would make anyone today groan and roll back under the covers. In winter, you might have had the luxury of a late, slow morning, though, of course, the cold probably woke you up anyway. Farmers dragged themselves out when they could see enough not to accidentally chop their own toes off with a scythe, and that was about as precise as mornings needed to be. Nobody looked at a sundial before deciding when to milk a cow. They just went outside, squinted at the light, and figured, yep, that'll do. If you wanted to be fancier, there were sundials, which were exactly what you think, a stick stuck in the ground, throwing a shadow across lines that some poor soul had carefully carved in stone. The shadow moved, the hour changed, everyone nodded like it was magic. Except it only worked when the sun was out, which, in medieval Northern Europe, meant not very often. Cloudy days threw the whole thing into chaos, leaving you with the extremely scientific measurement of, I guess it's around mid-morning, maybe. Some people had portable sundials, which sounds very sophisticated until you imagine a guy standing in the street, holding up a little brass disc and tilting it this way and that, muttering to himself while everyone else just rolled their eyes and kept walking. Not exactly the Rolex of its time. The real power, though, came from bells. If you lived near a church or monastery, those bells ruled your life. They rang when it was time for prayer, they rang when it was time for mass, they rang for feast days, fast days, or just because someone inside decided they felt like pulling on a rope. For monks, bells were their entire schedule, dragging them out of bed in the middle of the night for matins, then again at sunrise for lauds, then prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally compline before bed. That's 8 rounds of chanting and praying every single day, in case you're keeping score. And because monks lived like that, villagers around them sort of followed along. They didn't need to know it was precisely noon. They just heard the bells ring and thought, all right, time to eat lunch. Bells were like the medieval push notification, loud, unavoidable, and impossible to turn off. But bells weren't always enough. Inside houses after dark, people turned to candle clocks. You'd take a fat candle, carve marks into it, and as it burned down past each line, you knew an hour had passed. Simple, effective, and just a little bit terrifying if you lived in a thatched roof hut filled with straw mattresses. One wrong move, and your timekeeper became a house fire. But it had a certain poetry to it, watching your hours literally melt away in flickering light. It was cozy, if you ignored the fire hazard, and monks liked it because it gave them something to do besides complain about how cold their cloisters were. Water clocks were another option, and they had been around for centuries. A slow drip of water into a container, carefully measured, with little marks to show the hours. Drip, 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 until the day was gone. They weren't perfect. The flow changed with temperature, leaks happened, sometimes an animal thought it was a drinking bowl, but they were steady enough for monastic schedules and royal speeches. Imagine trying to time a sermon by how much water dripped into a pot. That was the reality. A little hypnotic, maybe even relaxing, as long as you didn't mind sitting there listening to the same dripping noise over and over, like living inside a very damp cave. Now here's the fun part. Medieval hours were not our hours. We think of an hour as always 60 minutes, no exceptions. Medieval people didn't. For them, an hour was 1/12 of the daylight, which meant hours stretched longer in summer and shrank shorter in winter. A summer hour in Northern Europe might be 90 minutes long. A winter hour, barely 45. Nights were also divided into 12 parts, so you got the same unevenness. Time was elastic, which sounds cool until you try to arrange anything. Meet me at the 4th hour, someone might say. Great, you'd reply. Is that the summer 4th hour or the winter 4th hour? Scheduling was chaos, but people made do, because no one was sitting around with a stopwatch. And honestly, most people didn't even bother with hours. They didn't care about minutes, and they definitely didn't care about seconds. Those were for astronomers or mathematicians. Regular people worked until their backs hurt, they baked bread until it smelled done, they waited for friends until the friend actually showed up. The smallest unit of time was basically a little while. If someone asked you to meet them soon, that could mean anywhere from a few minutes to an entire afternoon. There was no such thing as being 5 minutes late, because the concept of being late only works if there's a fixed schedule. And in the Middle Ages, there wasn't. It gave life a different rhythm. People rose with the sun, worked with the daylight, and rested with the dark. Monks had their endless prayers to keep them busy, and villagers had bells echoing through the valley to remind them what was happening. But no one panicked about losing a minute here or there. Nobody doom-scrolled their hour away. Time was softer, slower, and maybe just a little more forgiving. So tonight, as we drift further into this medieval world, picture yourself there. The sun setting, shadows stretching across the fields, bells tolling in the distance, candles flickering in small wooden houses, hours stretching and shrinking with the seasons, water dripping slowly in a monastery corner, monks trudging in half asleep to sing their psalms. A world without alarms, without deadlines, without seconds slipping away on a glowing screen. Just time, flowing gently, carrying everyone with it. If peasants lived by the sun and their roosters, monks lived by something else entirely, something far stricter and far less forgiving. Because if you've ever wondered who in the medieval world was obsessed enough with time to make it everybody else's problem, the answer is monks, always monks. They weren't content to let the day roll by in a blur of chores and meals. They had a schedule, a divine one, carved into their very way of life, and that schedule was not flexible, not negotiable, and certainly not designed for anyone's convenience. The divine office, as they called it, split the day and the night into neat slices of prayer, from the pre-dawn misery of matins to the half-asleep chanting of Compline before bed. In between were lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, and vespers, because apparently one round of prayers every few hours wasn't enough, and God really did want to hear from you 8 times a day, even if your voice cracked halfway through the Psalms. So bells rang at intervals no sane villager would ever keep track of, and monks shuffled through cold cloisters, chanting in Latin that nobody outside the walls understood. Imagine being a farmer trying to get a little sleep when suddenly, in the middle of the night, the monastery bells went off like the medieval equivalent of a car alarm, reminding everyone that the holy men down the road were dragging themselves out of bed to sing about salvation. Did villagers follow along? Not really. They might mumble a prayer here or there, but mostly the bells were just background noise, the ancient version of your neighbor's alarm clock going off through thin apartment walls. Inside the monasteries, though, the obsession with time was very real. Monks relied on sundials in the day, and candle clocks or water clocks at night, making sure they didn't miss their appointed hours. There are even stories of monks inventing clever contraptions, like weighted ropes that would drop at intervals, ringing bells automatically, because getting out of bed to ring the bell every time was exhausting even for the holiest of brothers. And of course, the more precise the measurements became, the more they bragged about their devotion. It wasn't enough to pray often. You had to prove you prayed at exactly the right moment, as if God were up there with a stopwatch, shaking his head every time you started 2 minutes late. For villagers, this system had mixed effects. On one hand, it meant life was marked by familiar sounds. You didn't need to own a clock, you just needed to be within earshot of a monastery tower. On the other hand, it meant your day was constantly punctuated by bells that had nothing to do with your crops, your sheep, or your need to take a nap after lunch. Still, people adapted. Market days started when the morning bells rang, meals were tied loosely to prayer hours, and seasonal festivals piggybacked on the church calendar. Time itself became sacred, and even if you weren't a monk, you lived in a world where the hours were shaped by people who measured them out in psalms. It's almost funny, though, because while monks were so rigid about their own schedules, the hours themselves were still elastic, still tied to the length of daylight. So yes, you might be required to attend terce at the 3rd hour of the day, but that 3rd hour could last much longer in June than in December. Imagine working in an office where your boss says you need to be at a meeting every 3rd hour, but the length of the hour changes depending on how long the sun stays up. That was medieval timekeeping, strict and yet imprecise, demanding and yet hilariously vague. And in their obsession with hours, monks also wrote about sleep, because of course they did. The Rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential guides for monastic life, laid out exactly when brothers should rise, how long they should pray, and even when they were allowed to nap. Spoiler: not very often. Midnight prayers meant monks were perpetually tired, nodding off in the choir stalls, and some orders got a reputation for being practically sleep-deprived zombies shuffling through their routines. Which, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter, you can probably imagine. Except these guys did it for decades, muttering prayers while staring at flickering candles and wondering if anyone would notice if they snuck back to bed. All of this was about discipline, of course. Time wasn't just about marking the day, it was about showing devotion, showing that you could master your body and your desires by living on God's clock instead of your own. Which sounds noble until you realize that in practice it meant a lot of cold, tired monks dragging their feet through stone hallways in the dark. But they did it, century after century, and in doing so, they shaped how medieval society thought about time. Ordinary people might not have cared what hour it was, but they knew the bells meant something, even if that something was just the monks are awake again, and so am I, thanks to all that ringing. Over time, this monastic obsession slowly trickled outward. Towns with important monasteries or cathedrals started structuring their days around the bell schedule. Guilds and markets aligned their hours with the sound of towers chiming. And eventually, when mechanical clocks started to appear in the late Middle Ages, they didn't arrive in people's homes. They showed up in church towers, echoing the same rhythms that monks had been using for centuries. Which is to say, the reason you look at a clock today and expect regular hours divided neatly across the day is partly because some medieval monk 200 years earlier was forcing himself out of bed at 3 in the morning to chant psalms in Latin. So, if you've ever cursed your alarm clock, you now know who to blame. And yet, for all their structure, life outside those walls remained wonderfully vague. Villagers still spoke in terms like after breakfast or when the sun is low. Journeys were measured in days, not hours, and if you told someone you'd meet them at noon, it just meant sometime when the sun is overhead, give or take an entire hour. Nobody cared. Nobody stressed about being late, because the only thing you could be late for was a bell you probably didn't care about anyway. It was a strange balance, a society half ruled by strict schedules and half floating in timelessness, with everyone kind of muddling through. And as you imagine those monks in their drafty halls, huddled around dripping water clocks or staring at the wax line on a candle, remember how different their sense of time was from ours. They weren't checking how many minutes had passed since the last email, they were just waiting for the next bell, the next chant, the next long stretch of hours that seemed to bend and shrink with the seasons. In a way, they lived in a world where time was more alive, tied to nature and ritual, less mechanical, less relentless. And maybe that's something to hold on to as we drift further into their story tonight, letting those bells echo faintly in the background of our own sleepy thoughts. As towns grew and life slowly shifted from tiny farming villages to bustling markets with guilds and merchants and endless noise, time began to matter in new ways. Because when you have more than 5 people trying to sell sheep, bake bread, and haggle over prices in the same square, suddenly it's useful if everyone agrees on roughly when the market actually starts. And of course, no one owned a personal clock, no pocket watches yet. Not even the rich could check the time on their wrists, so they relied on the same thing that monks had used for centuries. The bells, always the bells, ringing out across towns to mark when the shops opened, when people should break for midday, and when everyone needed to pack up before night fell and the streets turned into pitch-black alleys best avoided. By the 13th and 14th centuries, though, something new started showing up in the skylines. Huge, lumbering, slightly unreliable but very impressive contraptions. Mechanical clocks. These were not the kind of clocks you imagine hanging on a kitchen wall or sitting on your grandmother's mantelpiece ticking politely. No, these were towering machines of iron and wood, crammed into church towers and city halls, grinding and clanking away with weights and gears the size of furniture. And of course, they weren't accurate, not really. At best, they might tell you the rough hour, but not the minute, definitely not the second. Still, compared to waiting for a monk to decide it was time to yank the bell rope, these mechanical beasts were revolutionary. You could actually plan your day, sort of, at least if you were within hearing distance. They usually struck the hours with big booming gongs, which meant that entire towns began to develop the idea of a shared schedule. And if you're wondering who got to decide when the clock struck, the answer, unsurprisingly, is that it was still the church, because of course it was. God forbid regular townspeople had control over time itself. The first mechanical clocks didn't even have faces, which sounds hilarious now, but makes sense if you think about it. Nobody needed to stare at hands creeping around a circle. They just needed to hear the bell, to know that 1 hour had passed since the last deafening clang. The idea of looking up at a clock face and silently judging how late you were hadn't been invented yet. That special anxiety was still in the future, waiting to ruin modern mornings. Instead, these early clocks were more like big loud timers, a whole city alarm system, reminding everyone when to open the gates, when to call the council, or when to stop drinking and go home. And because these clocks were so large and so expensive, they became status symbols. Towns competed with each other to have the most impressive one, the loudest one, the one that clanged the farthest across the valley. Wealthy cities poured money into their tower clocks, partly to look holy, partly to look organized, and partly because medieval civic pride was basically one long contest of our town hall is bigger than yours. Some of these clocks even got extra features, like little figures that marched out and banged drums, or tiny wooden saints that nodded on the hour, because nothing says devotion like building a giant puppet show to remind you it's lunchtime. Accuracy was always a problem. Early mechanical clocks drifted constantly, running too fast or too slow depending on how the weights and gears were behaving. Clock keepers had to reset them often, usually by checking against the sun at noon, which meant that even though they were meant to free people from dependence on daylight, they still secretly leaned on the old system. And in practice, nobody cared if they were perfectly correct. If the town clock was 5 minutes off, so what? You couldn't even measure 5 minutes. All that mattered was that everyone agreed to live by the same strikes. In a world where time had always been fluid, even a slightly wobbly clock felt like progress. This also changed how people thought about their days. Before, villagers had lived on natural rhythms, planting and harvesting by the seasons, working as long as the light lasted, eating when they were hungry. Now, markets opened and closed to the sound of bells, guilds began regulating work hours by the town clock, and slowly but surely, life became less about the sun and more about the steady grind of gears in a tower. You can almost see the beginnings of modern time obsession creeping in, though of course medieval people weren't complaining about their lack of work-life balance. They were too busy trying not to die of plague or starvation. Still, the introduction of mechanical time meant that if a merchant promised to meet you at the second bell after dawn, you could trust that there was a public clock somewhere that would back him up. For the first time, time itself became a shared commodity. And of course, the wealthy took it further, because they always do. By the 15th century, portable mechanical clocks were starting to appear, but these weren't slipping into anyone's pocket. They were heavy, clunky things, more like furniture than gadgets, built into ornate cases and guarded jealously as proof that you had money to waste on knowing the hour. They were loud, too, ticking and striking with all the subtlety of a hammer on a kettle, the kind of object that reminded your servants that yes, you really were that important, because even your house could tell the time. The irony in all this is that while towns and nobles were embracing mechanical clocks, most peasants in the countryside kept right on living by the sun, the moon, and the rooster. They didn't have access to tower bells, and they certainly weren't dropping a year's wages on a private clock. Their days continued to run on the same rhythms they always had, and if you tried to tell them the precise hour, they probably would have laughed, shrugged, and gone back to plowing their field until dusk. Which meant that medieval society lived in two overlapping time zones. One mechanical, striking loudly in the towns, and one natural, drifting gently across the farms. Still, as more cities installed clocks, the sound of time became inescapable. Travelers noted how different towns seemed to live on slightly different schedules, depending on how well their clock was maintained or how stubborn the local priest was about resetting it. Time itself wasn't standardized yet, so the third hour in one town might not quite match the third hour in another just a few miles away. Imagine trying to coordinate a trip when every village had its own interpretation of the day. And yet, somehow, they managed. People met, markets bustled, and life went on, not with perfect precision, but with enough shared rhythm that society kept turning. And as you let that image settle in your mind, picture those medieval streets. Narrow, crowded, noisy, but above it all the slow, deliberate clang of a great tower clock, marking the hours as they passed. Each strike echoing across rooftops, rolling down crooked alleys, reminding everyone below that another piece of the day had slipped away. Not frantic, not minute by minute, but steady, imprecise, and strangely reassuring. A kind of heartbeat for the town, slow and uneven, but constant. And as the bells faded, people went on with their business, never watching the clock, because the clock would always tell them when it was time. As clocks began to spread into towns and cities, people slowly realized something both useful and annoying, which is that when time becomes measurable, it also becomes enforceable. Before, a guildmaster might have told you to show up in the morning and left it at that, which gave you the freedom to arrive whenever you felt the sun had climbed high enough to count. Now, with a clock tower hammering out the hours, there was suddenly a standard. Morning was no longer a vague concept. It was the first few hours after the bells rang at dawn, and if you weren't there by the right strike, your boss noticed. In other words, mechanical clocks made it possible to be late, and being late meant getting into trouble. Congratulations, the birth of workplace stress. Guilds and trade associations leaned into this new precision. If you were a craftsman, your hours could now be tied to the clock, not just to daylight. Work might start at the third bell, pause at the sixth for a meal, and end at the ninth, whether or not the sun was cooperating. Which meant shorter days in summer than peasants got, and longer days in winter, because the sun didn't matter anymore, the clock did. For medieval workers, this was progress, but the kind that felt suspiciously like a loss. Suddenly, time wasn't your own, it belonged to the schedule. Of course, nobody was punching in on little time cards yet, but the principle was there. The slow creep of regimentation had begun, and once people got used to the rhythm of bells and clanging gears, there was no turning back. Market life also shifted. Instead of merchants casually drifting in whenever their carts were loaded, towns began announcing official opening and closing hours. Buyers knew when to show up, sellers knew when to pack up, and everyone agreed on what noon meant, or at least they pretended to. It created efficiency, but also a new kind of pressure. If you missed the bells, you missed your chance to sell your turnips, and nobody wanted to be the fool standing in an empty square while the clock struck and everyone else had already gone home. And yet, for all this order, the system was still wobbly. Clocks went wrong, bells were struck too early or too late, and different towns disagreed on what hour it was anyway. You could set out on a journey thinking you left at the 5th hour, only to arrive at another town that insisted you'd actually set out at the 4th. Standardization was centuries away, and until then, time remained more of a local accent than a universal language. For ordinary villagers, though, especially those living outside the reach of the clock towers, timekeeping remained half mechanical and half natural. You worked as long as there was light, you rested when it got dark, and if you were near enough to hear the town bells, you might nod along, but if not, you simply shrugged and carried on. The rhythm of your life was still tied to the seasons, with summer days stretching endlessly and winter nights pressing in before dinner. The clock was a town luxury, like fancy walls or paved streets, nice to have but not strictly necessary when you had sheep to herd or wheat to thresh. And so medieval society lived in a split reality, with towns chasing the beat of iron gears and countryside villages wandering along on the softer measure of nature. But slowly, the clock won. Cities grew in power, trade expanded, and with that expansion came the need for greater coordination. Ships had to leave ports at agreed times, markets had to open together, and courts had to meet at predictable hours. The larger and more connected the world became, the less patience anyone had for whenever it happens. Bells struck across Europe, gears clanked in towers, and the sound of time became an inescapable part of daily life. And while nobody yet cared about minutes or seconds, the idea that you could live by an exact schedule had taken root. Once you start measuring time, you start organizing it, and once you start organizing it, you start controlling people with it. Not that anyone in the Middle Ages would have admitted to such a scheme, but give it a few centuries and the factory whistles of the Industrial Revolution would finish what the monks and their tower clocks had started. There was a certain irony to all of this, of course, because while time was becoming more precise, life itself was still incredibly uncertain. Plague, famine, war, none of those cared about the bells. You could be at Vespers one day and in a shallow grave the next. And yet, people clung to the rhythm, perhaps because it offered stability in a world that had very little. Knowing that the bells would ring, that the monks would chant, that the clock would strike, gave a sense of order even when everything else was chaos. It was comforting, even if it was also annoying, the way a familiar sound becomes both background noise and reassurance. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it now, the clang of iron bells echoing down stone streets, bouncing off cathedral walls, marking the hour as people scurry about their lives. A shoemaker leaning over his bench, a baker pulling loaves from the oven, a merchant setting out his goods, all glancing up when the bells strike, even if only for a moment, before carrying on. Each clang another piece of the day slipping away, steady, deliberate, and inescapable. And as the bells fade into silence, the town settles back into its rhythm, until the next strike comes, and the cycle begins again. As the Middle Ages stumbled toward their end and the Renaissance began poking its flamboyant little head out of the 15th century, timekeeping started to slip out of the towers and creep into homes, which was both impressive and mildly intrusive, because for the first time, private individuals could own machines that told them the hour, not just the collective clang of a town bell. These early household clocks were not the elegant little devices you might picture. They were heavy, clunky contraptions, often bigger than a modern microwave, and loud enough to make you wonder if silence had ever been invented. Wealthy nobles displayed them in their halls as status symbols, the way someone today might park a shiny sports car in the driveway just to prove they could. Guests would arrive, glance at the enormous iron clock squatting on the table, and know immediately that they were dealing with someone who had money to burn on noisy furniture. Accuracy was still not guaranteed, of course. A household clock might drift wildly from the town tower, but at least it gave the owner something to tinker with, resetting it every day by the sun or by the cathedral bells, as though being able to argue with your own machine was a mark of refinement. And from there, the obsession grew. Clocks became more compact, more ornate, and eventually, the rich began carrying portable versions, which sounds impressive until you realize that the first watches were not slipped casually into pockets. They were worn like awkward little boxes on chains, heavy lumps of metal that needed constant winding, and which mostly existed to impress your friends rather than actually tell you what time it was. If your device was accurate within an hour, you were doing well, which means a dinner guest could show up somewhere between 7 and 8 and still claim punctuality. For people who had spent centuries shrugging and saying, "I'll see you after lunch," this was progress. But for us, spoiled by digital precision, it sounds like barely an improvement at all. Still, the symbolism mattered. Owning time, carrying time, controlling time, all of that became wrapped up in power and status. It wasn't just about knowing the hour, it was about proving that you had the wealth and sophistication to measure life itself. Meanwhile, for ordinary folks, the shift was slower, but they weren't untouched. Towns with clocks demanded more punctual markets, workshops enforced stricter hours, and eventually even servants in great houses learned that the strike of the clock meant it was time to fetch, polish, or scrub. The bells no longer simply marked communal life, they began creeping into personal routines. When to wake, when to work, when to eat, all of it tied to the machinery of time. And though many peasants in the countryside still followed the sun and the seasons, even they began to feel the pressure when they came to market or traveled into town. Little by little, life became less about when the work feels done and more about when the clock says stop. It's almost ironic, really. For centuries, people had lived without minutes, without seconds, and no one had cared. Then suddenly, the rich were flaunting their timepieces like jewelry, the middle classes were hearing the bells of their town clocks nagging at them, and everyone began to internalize this idea that time was something that could be chopped up, counted, and measured. And once you start measuring something, you start worrying about it. If you've ever sat at your desk watching the seconds tick by until lunch, you have medieval clockmakers to thank for that creeping sense of doom. They didn't invent your boss breathing down your neck, but they gave him the tools to track exactly how long you were wasting. Of course, in the 15th and 16th centuries, all of this still felt new, almost magical. Clocks were marvels of engineering, little universes of gears and weights ticking away with hypnotic rhythm. People gathered to admire them, to listen to their strikes, to wonder at the possibility of mastering time itself. And there's a strange kind of poetry in that. The same society that had once stared at the sun and shrugged now stared at a brass dial and nodded solemnly, as though the universe had finally agreed to fit inside a wooden box. Was it accurate? Not really. Did it matter? Not entirely. But the feeling of precision was intoxicating, and once you give people the illusion of control, they'll cling to it, even if the gears are lying through their teeth. And as these machines spread, the world grew noisier. Tick, 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 a new soundtrack, softer than bells but more relentless. Towns struck their hours, houses echoed with the clatter of gears, and nobles wore their watches like badges of superiority. Time had become personal, not just communal. And once it became personal, it became inescapable. Even in the middle of the night, you might hear your household clock groaning and chiming, reminding you that another hour had slipped away while you tried in vain to sleep. Comforting or irritating, depending on your mood. Probably both. So imagine yourself in a late medieval town, the sun setting behind crooked rooftops, the tower clock booming across the square, merchants packing their stalls, and somewhere inside a wealthy home, a smaller clock chiming away, echoing the rhythm of the larger one. Outside the walls, farmers are still measuring time by the fading light, unbothered by minutes, unconcerned with precision. Inside, however, the gears turn, the bells strike, and the slow transformation continues. Time is no longer just the passage of day into night. It is now a thing that can be owned, displayed, and, increasingly, obeyed. And though medieval people didn't know it yet, the long road toward modern punctuality, toward schedules, deadlines, and stress, had already begun, one clanging bell and one ticking gear at a time. By the time mechanical clocks had settled into towers and homes and the tick of gears had become familiar background noise, something more subtle began to shift, something less about iron machinery and more about the human mind. For centuries, people had thought of time as something natural, something that just happened, like the sun rising or the seasons turning. But once you start measuring time, once you carve it into pieces and strike bells to announce its passing, people begin to feel that it isn't just passing, it's slipping away, wasted if not used properly, stolen if spent wrongly. In other words, people began to worry about time in a way they never had before. If you were a farmer, you used to stop working when it was too dark to see your own hands. Now, if you worked in a town guild, your master could look up at the tower clock and tell you that no, it wasn't time to stop yet, because the bell hadn't rung. For the first time in history, you could officially leave work too early. And nothing kills joy faster than someone telling you your free time hasn't technically started yet. This creeping sense of time as a resource to be controlled shows up in the records of guilds and trades. Blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, all began to regulate their hours more carefully. The quality of your work wasn't just judged by the product, but by how long you spent making it. And suddenly, workers could be accused of idleness not because they were lazy, but because they weren't in their workshop when the bells demanded it. This wasn't capitalism yet, but you can hear the faint jingling of coins in the background. Because once people began to think of hours as countable, the leap to time is money wasn't very far away. If time can be chopped up and measured, then it can be bought and sold, and once something can be bought and sold, someone will always find a way to make you sell more of it than you want. Even outside the workshops, this shift left its mark. Market days became stricter, courts began scheduling hearings by the clock instead of just after breakfast, and people started to live in tighter rhythms. For centuries, villagers had eaten when the food was ready, worked until their backs hurt, and gone to bed when it was dark. Now they ate at set times, worked at set times, and slept in the intervals that remained. Life became less fluid, less organic, less about nature and more about machinery. And in the process, people became just a little bit more anxious. It's one thing to feel the day slipping by because the sun is lower in the sky. It's another to hear a bell strike and know that an official hour is gone, a slice of your life chopped off by someone else's gears. Of course, not everyone welcomed this. Some resisted, some ignored the bells, some clung stubbornly to natural time. And in rural areas, especially far from the cities, people kept right on living by the old rhythms for centuries more. But the writing was on the wall. The clock was here to stay, and slowly, inexorably, the rest of society would bend to it. You could almost say that people didn't just adopt clocks, they became trapped by them, bound by the constant reminder that time was no longer an endless flow but a cage of hours. And yes, that sounds dramatic, but if you've ever stared at the numbers on your phone counting down the last minutes of your weekend, you know exactly what those medieval workers must have felt when the 9th hour bell rang and their break was officially over. And yet, for all the stress and structure, there was still comfort too. The bells that annoyed villagers at night were also the bells that reassured them the world was still turning, the monastery was still praying, God was still watching. A town without a clock tower felt incomplete, as though it was missing its heartbeat. Travelers noted how disorienting it was to walk through a city square and not hear the hours struck. People began to rely on the sound, even when they hated what it meant. That contradiction, that blend of comfort and control, has never really gone away. We still curse our alarms and yet panic when they fail. We still complain about schedules but cling to them for order. In a way, medieval people were just like us, caught between freedom and structure, annoyed by time but unable to live without it. So imagine those streets again, the sun dropping behind rooftops, the clock tower looming, its gears grinding, its bell rope swinging. The townspeople glance up, sigh, and nod, another hour gone. Some trudge back to their homes, others light candles and push through the work a little longer, the tick of gears echoing in their ears. They don't think about minutes or seconds, not yet, but they feel the weight of the hours, heavy and deliberate, shaping their lives whether they like it or not. And as the night deepens, the bells strike again, echoing across stone walls, a reminder that time never really stops, it only waits for the next clang, the next strike, the next hour slipping into the past. By the time the Renaissance started flexing its artistic muscles and Europe decided it was time to rediscover everything the ancient world had already known, clocks had moved from noisy town towers into wealthy homes, from crude lumps of gears into ornate brass contraptions that looked more like art than machines. But timekeeping wasn't just about markets and prayers anymore. It was about science, navigation, exploration, and showing off just how clever human beings could be when they put enough effort into fiddling with springs. Astronomers in particular began poking their noses into time, because if you wanted to chart the stars or predict an eclipse, you needed something a little more precise than whenever the bell rings. And slowly, time started to shift from a religious rhythm into a scientific one. This was partly practical, because ships were leaving Europe in increasing numbers, and sailors very quickly discovered that the ocean was not impressed by bells. If you were halfway to the New World, you couldn't just poke your head out of the hold, look at the cathedral tower, and say, "Ah yes, it's the 5th hour." You needed portable, accurate timekeeping, and that was a nightmare in an age when your pocket watch drifted more than your ship did. Navigation depended on knowing where you were, and where you were depended on knowing the time, and so scientists obsessed over clocks the way modern people obsess over phone upgrades. They tinkered, they argued, they promised solutions they couldn't deliver. It would take centuries to solve the problem fully, but the seed was planted here, in an age when men in wigs squinted at gears and swore that if they just adjusted one more spring, everything would finally make sense. Meanwhile, back on land, clocks continued to multiply. Towns competed for the grandest, loudest, and most elaborate ones, because nothing says civic pride like a giant machine that clangs on the hour. Some were so ambitious they didn't just tell the time but also tracked the zodiac, the phases of the moon, and sometimes even performed little puppet shows when the bells struck. Because if you're already spending a fortune on a clock, why not make it a miniature theatre as well? Town squares filled with gawkers watching little saints march out on the hour, nodding their wooden heads, reminding everyone that time wasn't just practical, it was entertainment too. Imagine gathering a crowd just to watch your city's clock do a trick. That was medieval Netflix. And with each improvement, people's relationship to time grew tighter. The bells became more frequent, the ticks more insistent, the measurements more precise. Monks had once divided the day into uneven hours tied to sunlight, but now mathematicians were carving it into exact lengths, demanding consistency, pressing life into sharper edges. The idea of minutes began to creep into awareness, not for ordinary villagers yet, but for scholars and city dwellers who could afford to care. Seconds were still exotic, the plaything of astronomers, but the march toward precision had begun, and once society starts down that path, it rarely stops. Of course, most ordinary people still weren't impressed. Farmers rose with the sun, bakers baked when the dough was ready, and nobody out in the fields gave a thought to whether it was 7:15 or 7:20. But the presence of clocks in town squares, in churches, and in noble halls meant that even if you ignored them, you heard them. The clang of bells became unavoidable, and eventually, the tick of smaller machines followed you home. Time became inescapable not just as an idea but as a sound, a noise you could not quite tune out. And even though nobody was panicking about being a few minutes late to a dinner party, you can see the shape of modern anxiety forming, curled inside those gears like a cat waiting to pounce. And yet, there was wonder too. For all their inaccuracy, clocks were magical to the people who saw them for the first time. A machine that moved by itself, without human hands, turning steadily, predictably, endlessly. In an age when most things were powered by muscle or wind, a self-moving device felt like sorcery. Towns bragged about their clocks the way they bragged about their cathedrals, as proof that God favored them, as evidence that civilization had taken root in their square. And perhaps there was comfort in it too, in a world of famine and plague, to know that something kept moving forward no matter how chaotic life became. The clock didn't care if your harvest failed. The clock didn't care if war burned your fields. It ticked on, steady, implacable, a sound both reassuring and slightly menacing. So as the Renaissance gathered steam, time itself began to change shape. It was no longer just bells in the dark or shadows on a dial. It was mathematics, astronomy, exploration. It was gears turning not just for prayer but for power. And ordinary people, whether they wanted to or not, found themselves living in a world where hours were sharper, minutes were creeping in, and life itself was being measured with increasing precision. They didn't yet live by the second, not quite, but the idea that they might was already whispering in the ticking of every clock. And if you let yourself imagine it, you can hear that whisper now, echoing through stone towers, drifting through narrow streets, carried in the deep clang of iron bells. Another hour passed, another gear turned, another piece of life gone, counted and marked. Not frantic, not rushed, but steady, implacable, relentless. Time becoming something you could not escape, not even in your sleep. By the time the Renaissance began fading into the early modern world, clocks had fully escaped the monasteries and towers that birthed them and were beginning to colonize everyday life, or at least the lives of people who could afford to live somewhere more interesting than a damp field. Cities beat with the rhythm of bells, workshops buzzed under the watch of ticking gears, and even households started to hum with the faint noise of mechanical time. And once the machines existed, society did what society always does. It found ways to use them for discipline. Guilds that once relied on vague hours tied to sunlight now enforced strict start and stop times. The clock no longer just told the time, it told you what to do with it, and this was a subtle but profound change. Before, you might have wandered into work when you were ready, shrugged off a late start, and left when the day felt done. Now, the bell struck, and suddenly there was an official beginning and an official end, and you were expected to follow it. The freedom of the sun was slowly replaced by the tyranny of the gong. This shift crept into homes as well. Meals began to align with the strikes of bells rather than the hunger of bellies. Sleep shifted too, no longer just a matter of sunset and exhaustion, but increasingly shaped by the rhythms of clocks that chimed through the night. Even social life bent under the new order. Markets opened on the bell, courts convened on the bell, and festivals began on the bell. In many ways, the bell was becoming the true voice of authority, second only to the church, and perhaps more inescapable. You could avoid the priest if you wanted to. You could not avoid the sound of iron ringing across stone walls. It wasn't all grim, of course. Many people welcomed the order, especially in growing cities where chaos lurked around every corner. If everyone agreed to meet at the 7th hour, then at least in theory, there was less confusion, fewer misconnections, and smoother trade. Merchants liked it, officials liked it, and eventually even workers began to adjust, because once you're used to being told when to start and stop, it starts to feel normal. Still, there was an undercurrent of resentment, a sense that time had shifted from being something you lived in to being something that lived over you, pressing down like an unseen master. If you've ever glared at an alarm clock in the morning, muttering under your breath as though it were a sentient enemy, you're channeling the exact same energy medieval townspeople must have felt when the bells dragged them into yet another day of labor. Meanwhile, technology kept nudging things forward. Clocks became more reliable, more ornate, and eventually, more portable. Wealthy homes boasted mantel clocks that struck with pomp, reminding guests that their host not only owned land but owned the very hours themselves. Watches became slightly less absurd, shrinking into things you might actually carry without breaking your neck. And with each improvement, people's sense of time tightened. They no longer tolerated wild inaccuracies. A clock that drifted by an hour was no longer charming, it was embarrassing. Precision became the new luxury, and with precision came pressure. If you can know the hour exactly, then you are expected to act exactly on the hour. The wiggle room of around noon shrank into the sharper edges of at noon, and life became just a little less forgiving. What's fascinating is that while clocks were enforcing discipline in cities, vast stretches of Europe still moved at a different pace. Villages far from towers lived as they always had, by the sun, by the moon, by the seasons. Farmers rose when it was light and slept when it was dark, and bells meant little in the open countryside. Two worlds existed side by side, one mechanical, rigid, and ordered, the other natural, flexible, and flowing. But the mechanical world was growing stronger, and slowly, inevitably, the natural one would bend to it. As trade expanded, as cities grew, as roads linked more towns together, the bells reached further, and the tick of gears crept into more ears. Time was spreading like an empire, conquering every corner it touched. And yet, for all the control it promised, clocks also gave a strange sense of security. In a world of plagues, wars, and famines, the steady tick of gears and the regular strike of bells offered comfort. You might not know if you'd survive the winter, but you knew the bell would ring at sext, you knew the town clock would clang at noon, and you knew time itself was still turning. The constancy was almost soothing, even as it bound people tighter into schedules they hadn't asked for. That contradiction is still with us today. We loathe the alarm that drags us from bed, but we panic if it doesn't go off. We curse deadlines, but we crave order. Medieval people felt the same, even if they didn't yet have the word deadline to mutter darkly under their breath. So picture that early modern city square again, the cobbles worn by carts, the air thick with the smell of smoke and bread, the tower clock looming above it all, gears grinding, bells ready to strike. People glance up, sigh, adjust their pace. Some hurry to market before the stalls close, others trudge to work before their master notices they're late, and others simply stop for a moment, watching the figures move on the clock face, marveling at the tiny saints or painted zodiac signs that wheel around like a miniature universe. Time has become something they can see, something they can hear, something they can almost touch. It is no longer the vague drift of sunlight but a measured, marked, mechanical rhythm, steady and unstoppable. And as another hour clangs out across the square, life bends once more to its sound, caught in the slow tightening grip of the clock. By the time clocks had settled into towers, markets, and noble homes, time was no longer just a convenience or a curiosity. It was becoming a moral issue. Which sounds dramatic, but humans have a long tradition of turning everyday habits into lectures, and time was no exception. The church, always eager to remind people what they should be doing, began framing punctuality as a sign of virtue. To be late was not just to be careless, it was to disrespect the order God had placed in the world. Priests thundered from pulpits about idleness, about wasting hours that could have been spent working, praying, or serving the community. If you didn't show up when the bells rang, you weren't simply disorganized, you were slipping towards sin. Because nothing makes life fun like being told your inability to arrive on time is a moral failing. And so people began to feel time not just as something that passed, but as something that judged them. The farmer who lingered too long in bed was suddenly lazy. The apprentice who arrived after the guild bell rang was irresponsible. The woman who dawdled at market risked being called frivolous. The clock wasn't just keeping order, it was keeping score. And once that idea took root, there was no shaking it. Time became something you could waste, something you could misuse, something you could hoard if you were clever enough. Suddenly, every hour mattered, not just because it passed, but because someone was always ready to tell you what you should have been doing with it. This moral obsession crept into daily rhythms. Meals that had once happened whenever the food was ready now became pinned to bells and clocks. Midday meant dinner, evening meant supper, not because your stomach told you so, but because the bells had rung. Sleep shifted too. In earlier centuries, people often slept in two segments: a first sleep after dusk, waking for an hour or two in the night to pray, talk, or even visit neighbors, and then a second sleep until dawn. But as clocks began to dominate life, and as bells rang at stricter intervals, that older rhythm slowly faded, replaced by the expectation of sleeping in one long stretch, neatly bounded by the hours. The body's natural drift gave way to the mechanical measure. Even rest became something to schedule. And yet, while towns tightened their schedules, the wealthy turned time into a status symbol. Owning a watch was not just practical, it was proof that you controlled time itself, that you carried it with you like a servant on a chain. Early watches were clumsy, heavy things, often wildly inaccurate, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the image. To pull out a watch in front of others was to say, "I have mastered the hour. I do not wait for the bells, I command them." It was fashion, power, and technology rolled into one, a small, ticking reminder that some people had more hours to spend than others. And of course, the irony was that the more people flaunted their watches, the more obvious it became that time was not equal. A poor villager still lived by the sun, still stumbled through days ruled by weather and work, while a noble could glance at his gilded contraption and decide, at least in theory, that he was above such petty uncertainty. But even the poor couldn't escape forever. Markets depended on bells, guilds enforced hours, cities demanded order. Slowly, even those who never owned a watch began to feel its weight. Punctuality became expectation, lateness became failure, and the idea of wasting time became a quiet, constant anxiety. You can almost hear it in the sermons, the manuals, the moral tales. Do not squander the hours God has given you, for you will not get them back. A medieval spin on time is money, except with more guilt and fewer bank accounts. And if you've ever sat through a motivational talk where someone scolded you for not waking up at 5 in the morning, congratulations. You have experienced the same timeless nonsense, just without the smell of incense and candle wax. And so the rhythm of life grew sharper, narrower, more precise. Markets opened on the bell, guild halls convened on the bell, meals were eaten on the bell, and even leisure began to shrink into measured spaces. People joked about idleness, but they also feared it. To sit too long, to rest too often, was to tempt disapproval. Every hour carried expectation. And while peasants in remote villages might still shrug and ignore the whole business, the direction of history was clear. The clocks were winning. The bells were winning. The hours were tightening, and the world was slowly becoming a place where time was not just something that passed, but something that demanded obedience. And yet, for all the pressure, people also found comfort in the order. A world ruled by famine, plague, and war was unpredictable at best. The strike of the bell, the tick of the watch, the clank of gears, these were steady, reliable, constant. You could depend on them in a way you could not depend on the harvest or your health. And so people leaned into the rhythm, even when they hated it. They cursed the bells and yet listened for them, despised the clocks and yet trusted them, resented the sermons about wasting hours and yet absorbed every word. Because once time becomes measurable, once it becomes a cage, it also becomes a shield. You know where you stand, even if you don't like it. So picture a town square again, the market stalls packed, the smell of bread and smoke drifting through the air, and above it all, the tower clock preparing to strike. Merchants glance up, apprentices hurry their work, guild masters nod with approval. A noble checks his watch, smug in the knowledge that he carries what others must listen for. The bell clangs, echoing through stone walls, bouncing off cobbled streets, rolling into every ear within reach. Another hour gone, another judgment passed, another reminder that time is no longer just the drift of sun and shadow, but a ruler in its own right. And as the sound fades, the town moves on, tighter, sharper, more bound to the march of hours than ever before. By the time Europe stumbled into the modern age, with its ships crossing oceans and its merchants counting coins as if the sound might bring them comfort at night, clocks were no longer novelties. They were fixtures. The great towers had become the heartbeat of cities, the watches had become the ornaments of nobles, and the ticking of gears had become so common that people stopped noticing it, even as it shaped every moment of their days. The shift was so complete that few remembered what life had been like before, when the sun itself was the only clock, when a rooster could decide your morning, when work ended not with a clang but with the fading of light. Time had changed from a natural rhythm into a machine, and people, willingly or not, had changed with it. Of course, it wasn't smooth. Standardization lagged behind. One town's hour might be slightly ahead of the next, depending on how diligent the clock keeper was in adjusting it. You could walk a few miles and suddenly find yourself in the wrong time zone, long before anyone had invented the phrase. Sailors cursed their watches, merchants blamed their clocks, monks muttered at their sundials, and yet everyone still leaned on them. Because once you begin to measure time, you cannot go back to ignoring it. The illusion of precision becomes addictive, even when the reality is still sloppy. People began to expect order, to demand it, to align their lives with it. The clock had become more than a tool. It was a master, sometimes benevolent, sometimes cruel, but always present. And with mastery came new anxieties. If time could be measured, it could be wasted. If it could be wasted, it could be lost. And if it could be lost, then your very life could be judged not by what you had done, but by how you had spent the hours you were given. It is no coincidence that sermons about idleness multiplied as clocks spread. The tick of gears was joined by the tick of conscience. Every wasted afternoon was no longer just a pleasant drift of rest, but a tiny theft from the finite supply of hours you had left. Priests thundered about it, nobles boasted of their efficiency, workers endured lectures from masters who waved their watches like little weapons. Time had become a currency, invisible but powerful, traded in minutes and hoarded in hours, and once people accepted that, they could never again look at the passing day with indifference. And yet, there was still wonder. To own a clock was to own a miracle. To hear a town bell strike was to feel part of something larger, a rhythm that tied everyone together, a communal heartbeat echoing across streets and valleys. The sound reassured as much as it commanded. People may have resented being dragged from bed by midnight bells or chided for arriving late at market, but they also leaned on that order. A world without clocks felt unthinkable once the gears began to turn. And perhaps that is why they spread so fast, not just because they were useful, but because they soothed the human craving for structure in a life filled with chaos. The clock did not cure famine or plague, but it offered certainty. And certainty is its own kind of comfort. As the centuries turned, the obsession only deepened. Minutes became common, seconds crept in, precision grew sharper. Time became a cage with finer bars. The industrial world would one day hammer it into whistles and factory schedules, into train timetables and punch cards. But even in the medieval world, even in the first age of bells and clumsy gears, you can see the seeds. You can see the moment when people first looked at their lives and thought, not simply the day is passing, but the hour is slipping. And in that thought lies the whole history of modern anxiety, the restless tick that still drives us now. And yet, if you lie back for a moment and imagine it differently, it's not only a story of control. It's also a story of rhythm, of sound and light and shadow. Imagine again a medieval village at dusk, the sky turning gold, the air cooling, the last sheep herded home. In the distance, a bell tolls, deep and slow, echoing across fields. People glance up, nod, and carry on. The day is done. Time has been marked. But no one checks a screen, no one counts the minutes, no one panics about losing 5 seconds to distraction. They live in the flow, shaped by bells and candles, by water dripping in a quiet bowl, by the slow creep of a shadow across stone. Their time is not ours, but it was enough. And so, as we drift to the end of this long story, remember that time itself has always been slippery, that the hours we count so carefully now were once elastic, uneven, almost playful. That what we see as punctuality and precision was once chaos and chance. And that somewhere in the distance, across the centuries, monks still shuffle through their cloisters, peasants still rise with the sun, and bells still ring across stone valleys, steady and unhurried. Time passes, as it always has. Now we're heading to Japan, back to the days when samurai walked the land, swords at their sides, honor codes in their heads, and probably way too much stress from serving lords who could order them into battle at a moment's notice. But tonight, we're not going into battle. No heroic clashes, no cinematic duels under cherry blossoms, no slow-motion katana swings. No. Tonight we're doing something far more unusual. We will listen, the samurai on their day off. Because the truth is, even warriors don't spend every hour fighting. Most of life, even for the sword-wielding elite of Japan, was a lot of waiting, a lot of practicing, a lot of, honestly kind of boring routines. And when they weren't training or being ordered around, they had downtime. Which means we get to ask, what exactly did a samurai do when they didn't have to fight? Spoiler, it wasn't always glamorous. Sometimes it was tea. Sometimes it was poetry. Sometimes it was falconry. And sometimes it was just sitting around, sulking, and waiting for the next paycheck from their daimyo lord, which was usually late. So let's dim the lights, settle in, and walk quietly into that quieter world. A samurai's day off. Less katana clashing, more awkward hobbies. If you woke up in a samurai household, the first thing you'd notice is that despite the reputation for constant discipline, mornings weren't actually filled with sword fights in the kitchen. A samurai family woke up like anyone else. Tatami mats rolled back, the smell of rice steaming, children already making noise, and the faint creak of wooden floors. The swords, of course, were nearby, displayed properly, because etiquette demanded it. But you weren't exactly leaping into armor just to have breakfast. Most days were peaceful, and your armor would gather dust in its box for weeks, even months at a time. Breakfast was simple. Rice, maybe miso soup, maybe pickled vegetables if your stipend stretched far enough. Because here's the thing, not all samurai were rich. In fact, a lot of them weren't. The romantic idea of samurai as endlessly wealthy warriors living in elegant houses with endless gardens? That was the top tier. Most samurai lived modestly, supported by stipends from their lords, stipends that didn't always keep up with the cost of living. So you ate plainly. You lived plainly. You might even quietly resent how little your honor bought you at the market. But at least you could remind yourself that you were samurai, and technically above the farmers and merchants outside your door. Even if the merchant was probably richer than you. Once breakfast was done, the question became, what to do with the day? Training. Yes. Sword drills, archery, horseback practice. But you weren't training from dawn until dusk like some martial arts movie montage. A lot of the time, samurai trained in short bursts, then spent the rest of the day on other pursuits. And this is where their hobbies come in. Because if you were a samurai on a free day, you were expected to be more than just a fighter. You were supposed to be cultured. Which meant things like poetry. Yes, poetry. Warlords who could order massacres also sat down to write delicate verses about frogs and moonlight. Samurai might spend an afternoon composing haiku, not because they were all secret artists, but because culture was part of their role. A warrior wasn't complete without refinement. Strength in battle, elegance in writing. Call it balance. Or call it the most passive-aggressive book club imaginable. Tea was another pastime, but don't picture casual mugs of green tea at the kitchen table. No, we're talking about the tea ceremony. Elaborate, ritualized, slow. A samurai on his day off might attend a tea gathering, kneeling on tatami mats while a host carefully whisked matcha, every gesture codified, every movement precise. It wasn't just about drinking tea. It was about discipline, mindfulness, aesthetics, and yes, a little bit about showing off your fancy tea bowls. Imagine a warrior who could cut you down in battle sitting quietly, nodding solemnly over the way steam curled from a ceramic cup. That was the point. The tea ceremony was a controlled, calm counterpart to the chaos of battle. The samurai had to be comfortable in both worlds, the battlefield and the tea room. And then there was falconry. Because what else are you going to do on your day off but strap a hawk to your arm and watch it terrorize small birds? Samurai loved falconry. It was considered refined, noble, a mark of status. You didn't just hunt for food, you hunted for sport, for display, for the sheer satisfaction of proving you had both the wealth to own a trained bird and the leisure to spend hours letting it swoop at prey. Walking through the countryside, hawk on your glove, sword at your side, you were the picture of elite leisure. Did it make you more effective in war? Not really. Did it make you look important? Absolutely. And looking important was half the job. Some samurai turned to painting or calligraphy. Ink brushes scratching across paper, copying Chinese poems, sketching bamboo. It wasn't always good. Some of them had the artistic skill of a tired toddler, but that wasn't the point. The point was cultivation, proving that you were more than muscle with a sword. A true samurai was supposed to be well-rounded. If you could cut a man down in the morning and paint a wistful crane in the afternoon, you were the ideal. Even if your crane looked more like a lopsided chicken. Of course, not all samurai were interested in cultural refinement. Some gambled. Some drank. Some complained endlessly about their stipends. And some just sat around waiting for their lords to summon them. A samurai's life could be oddly idle, filled with long stretches of boredom broken up by bursts of duty. Which is why, when they had free time, some embraced refinement and others spiraled into mischief. The stereotype of the drunken, brawling samurai wasn't entirely made up. Honor code or not, some guys just couldn't handle a day off. But most days were quiet. Training, tea, poetry, a walk with a falcon, maybe a trip to the bathhouse. Life outside of battle was ordinary, even slow. A samurai's day off wasn't about constant action. It was about proving you could live with grace in the in-between moments, that your worth wasn't just in how you fought, but in how you carried yourself in peace. So as you picture it now, imagine a samurai kneeling in his home, brush in hand, writing out a simple verse about autumn leaves. Outside, the city hums. Merchants shout, farmers unload goods, children run through alleys. Inside, it is calm. The swords rest quietly in their stand. The falcon waits patiently on its perch. The tea kettle hisses softly. The warrior is at peace, not because the world is peaceful, but because for once, he has the day to himself. So let's take the sandals off, slide the shoji quietly, and step into the house on a day when nothing urgent is happening, which, ironically, is when the most ordinary truths show up. The tatami smells a little like straw and old summer. The swords rest on their stand, because yes, even on a day off they get a place of honor, like very sharp roommates who refuse to move out. Breakfast is simple. Rice if the stipend held out. Pickles if last month's accounts didn't implode. Maybe miso if the merchant across the lane extended credit again, which he probably did, because he's generous like that, and also because he enjoys watching a hereditary warrior class borrow from a man who technically ranks beneath them. It's fine. Everything's fine. The ledger says otherwise, but we are not opening the ledger yet. It's a day off. Money first, because the house runs on it whether anyone admits it or not. Samurai stipends arrive in rice, counted in koku, which sounds noble until you try paying the brush seller with a sack of grain. So families convert rice to cash through brokers who take their cut with a smile so polite it practically bows on its own. Prices slide. Stipends don't. Merchants get richer. Of course they do. A low-ranking retainer peers at the month's numbers, notices the ink leaning a little too hard into red, and decides today is a perfect day to practice frugality, again. The wife is already there, the real logistics genius of this house, quietly turning 3 coins into a week of meals and pretending not to notice when the scabbard fittings coincidentally show up at the pawn shop every spring. No one says the word pawn. The euphemism is temporarily resting. The sword, naturally, stays. Status is status. Accessories can. Take a nap. Clothes matter too, because appearance is half your job and the half people see. At home, a plain kimono, sleeves rolled, practicality winning. Going out, the layers sharpen up. Hakama tied right, crest visible. Kamishimo if there's a call to make and the gossip circuits are humming. Swords worn with care. The long blade angled correctly, the short blade never forgotten, etiquette and furniture placement negotiated every time you sit down. There is a choreography to merely existing, and on a day off you practice it the way other people practice scales. You rehearse being composed so often that it becomes the only thing holding the week together. Domestic life moves in small rings. The courtyard garden needs raking, stones arranged with the kind of seriousness that makes outsiders laugh until they try it and realize the gravel never looks quite right. A quiet half hour with the oil and cloth, tending to the blade that hopefully won't be needed today. It's just maintenance. Like sweeping, but for steel. The children have copybooks out, learning characters and moral sayings, because the household spine isn't war, it's handwriting and patience. A son mutters through a Confucian sentence about filial duty while angling a brush like it's heavier than any spear. A daughter combs her hair, pins it, unpins it, pins it again, practicing both neatness and the political finesse of not wasting hair oil when oil is expensive, and auntie is coming to inspect everything with eyes that see through walls. Then errands. A stroll through the merchant quarter where money actually moves. Fabric sellers with bolts you can't afford, lacquerware that gleams like a small sun, and the book dealer who pretends not to notice you hovering over imported poetry while explaining, for the 5th time, that store credit is not technically a stipend. Somewhere a kabuki flyer flaps, promising a spectacle the censors definitely warned you about, which of course means you're thinking about going, not in armor, not even as a samurai exactly, just as a person hunting for a cheap seat and a reason to laugh. With plausible deniability. If anyone asks, you were at a shrine the entire evening being extremely reflective. And yes, the shrine. Even on a day off, there's a cadence to visiting gates painted so bright they seem to hum, washing hands at the stone basin, stepping up, leaving a coin, ringing a bell with a seriousness that makes your throat settle. The offering is small, the inclination of the head precise, the prayer practical. Keep the roof sound. Keep the knees steady. Keep the stipend from shrinking further. Keep everyone I owe from seeing me first. Then a slow walk back under trees that know more history than any diary. If it's spring, the blossoms show off like they own the world. If it's autumn, maple leaves flame out and drift the way old promises drift. You pretend not to be sentimental and fail. Back home, culture does its quiet work. A friend drops by with a small box of sweets wrapped neatly, the social equivalent of declaring peace. You boil water, wipe the bowl, set the whisk just so. The tea isn't luxury. It's a pause that understands it is the day's entire point. Gestures level the breath, fold, lift, turn, offer. It looks like nothing and feels like oxygen. Talk stays light, mostly. A poem leaked from a famous hand, a rumor about a Lord's inspection tour, the predictable complaint about stipends that make even humble fans feel extravagant. Laughter stays soft, the sort that fades on purpose so the neighbors don't get jealous or, worse, interested. A different kind of visit means a different kind of performance. The steward from the castle may come by with a message framed as a suggestion. Sankin obligations shifting. A cousin needs lodging for a week. A lord's minor ceremony wants an audience and hands. This is where a day off becomes administrative yoga. The bow says, happy to assist. The stomach says how. You calculate sleeping space in your head while offering tea as if you're not doing math under your eyelids. The steward leaves with many polite phrases and precisely 0 answers to your questions about whether the expense will be reimbursed. You already know the answer. Of course it won't. Lunch is unremarkable and therefore successful. Rice, greens, maybe fish if today is a special kind of ordinary. Chopsticks click against the bowl like a small metronome for not thinking about politics. After, there's a game. Go stones placed with a sound like raindrops. You try not to be competitive and fail gracefully, which is a good summary of the entire class identity. The board's territory lessons are obvious and still useful. Hold shape, don't chase every fight, accept that life is sometimes 2 eyes in a corner and an endgame that looks calmer than it felt. Afternoon leans into maintenance again. Armor gets a glance, cords tightened, laces inspected, because the day you don't check is the day a string snaps while you're bowing in front of someone who remembers forever. Paperwork lurks. A record of rice owing. A note about repairs due. A line about the neighbor's fence that is, technically, definitely, almost on your side. You write with a calm hand and a sentence that performs mutual respect to the point of comedy. You will both ignore the fence until you are both annoyed enough to fix it at the same time and call it harmony. A merchant calls. He brings a small cloth pouch and the exact tone of voice that says he lives in a reality that pays interest. You do the ritual, decline, accept, insist you will settle soon, promise nothing specific, and hand him a poem you copied last week because if you can't pay like a rich man, you can at least deflect like a polite one. He bows. You bow. You both understand the theater and compliment each other's performance. Late afternoon loosens. A bathhouse visit, steam rising, chatter filling the gaps between shoulders that finally stop bracing. News spreads here faster than any courier. Who's been promoted? Who's in debt? Who left for study and will definitely not be back until creditors forget faces? You say little, listen a lot, and pretend the water is hotter than the topics. On the way home you buy tofu that wobbles like ethics and dried fish that doesn't. You pass a falconer returning with a bird that looks smug on principle. You feel a small, unhelpful urge to take up a hobby that eats smaller hobbies for fun. Evening lands with the small ceremonies that keep households from unraveling. Slippers aligned. Swords resting at the correct angle. A lamp trimmed. A string retied because details are either nothing or everything and somehow both at once. Supper comes and goes without drama, which is how you measure victory now. Conversation is comfortable, the kind of talk that knows when silence is doing a better job. The children recite a poem and fall asleep before finishing line 3. Someone mends a sleeve and pretends the thread is more interesting than the future. If there is moon, you look at it because everyone does, and everyone pretends they weren't waiting for an excuse. If there is rain, you listen to it and tell yourself the roof was mended correctly this time, even though you know precisely where the first drip will appear if it wasn't. A cricket interrupts the quiet like a tiny critic. You let it. A neighbor laughs in the next house over. You decide to like them tonight. What did the samurai do on a day off? This. A practiced normal. The art of staying composed when the ledger is wheezing. The skill of honoring traditions that mostly exist to keep hands busy while heads worry more gently. A balance between steel you almost never draw and a tea bowl you lift like it might break your reputation if you fumble it. People imagine glory. You imagine groceries. They picture duels. You picture not tripping over the threshold while wearing new sandals in front of a man who keeps lists. History will remember titles, edicts, battles. A house remembers how smoothly the door slid today, how the whisk bloomed the tea, how the children pronounced a hard character correctly on the second try. Night asks for softness. The swords are in their stand, calm as sleeping cats. The ledger stays closed, a daring move counted as self-care. You rehearse tomorrow's bow once in your head, twice with your shoulders. The family breathes its quiet chorus. The lamp says it can last one more hour if you want a poem. But you know that line leads to another and then morning. You choose sleep. Not heroic. Just useful. The kind of choice that keeps ordinary days from coming apart. Outside, the lane is almost empty. Somewhere, a shamisen phrases a melancholy that refuses to be sad. You are not on duty. You are still practicing. Which, in this life, counts as rest. So the swords are polished, the tatami is swept, the tea bowl has done its little performance, and the ledger is still pretending it doesn't exist. A samurai's day off isn't about action so much as about appearances. And appearances, in this society, are practically a second paycheck. You live in a world where people will judge you not by the number of battles you fought, because honestly, most samurai weren't constantly at war, but by how gracefully you carry yourself while buying radishes. The truth is, your leisure time is as much on display as your service time. Which means that even when you're off, you're still on. This is where etiquette slides in like an uninvited relative who insists on staying the whole weekend. You don't just walk around the town, you walk with the measured pace of someone rehearsing their own statue. Your hakama must fall neatly, your swords must sit at the perfect angle, and when you pass another samurai you nod with precisely the right depth to signal respectful but not groveling. Entire guidebooks existed just to remind you how not to embarrass yourself in public. The way you bowed, the way you sat, the way you drank tea, it was all a kind of social choreography. Mess it up, and you weren't just clumsy, you were dishonorable. Imagine spilling your drink in a tavern and being told you had dishonored your ancestors. That's the level of pressure we're talking about. And yet, this rigid system of etiquette gave samurai an odd kind of hobby. They practiced looking right. At home, a day off might mean arranging your sitting position just so, rehearsing how to kneel without looking like your knees were screaming, or balancing a cup in your hand as if gravity had signed a peace treaty with you personally. Some men spent more energy polishing the details of posture than practicing swordsmanship. After all, your lord might never need you to cut anyone, but he would definitely see you sit at a banquet. Better to have the bow right than the blade sharp, at least most of the time. But culture went deeper than posture. Samurai were expected to be literate, to compose poetry, to dabble in painting and calligraphy. On a day off, you might sit at a low table, brush in hand, practicing Chinese characters or copying verses about mountains and rivers you hadn't actually seen. The idea wasn't to be a genius. The idea was to be competent. To prove you weren't just a man with a sword, but a man with refinement. There's a certain irony in warriors writing delicate haiku about frogs by ponds, but it was part of the code. Balance the steel with softness. Be dangerous, but also look like you can appreciate how pretty the moon is tonight. And then, of course, there was dress. If you were going out, you layered carefully. Not just for warmth, but for hierarchy. Family crests displayed just right, fabrics cleaned even if they were patched, sandals tied without frayed edges. The rich might strut in silk, while the poorer samurai disguised wear with careful folding and strategic mending. The goal was always to project dignity, even if the rice supply at home was down to crumbs. And yes, merchants knew. Merchants always knew. They'd smile as you bought on credit again, bowing respectfully while privately tallying the fact that the warrior class owed them half the city. Samurai walked with swords at their waists, but many of them were one missed stipend away from disaster. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it. The silence was the etiquette. Leisure often doubled as networking. A day off could mean visiting another samurai household, bringing a small gift, sharing tea, and quietly gauging where alliances stood. Conversations tiptoed around politics while pretending not to. A casual remark about a lord's mood might be a veiled warning. A joke about taxes might be a confession in disguise. You didn't just rest on your day off, you managed relationships. And if you played it well, those quiet visits mattered more than 100 hours of sword drills. Influence lived in the tea room, not on the battlefield. For those less inclined to polite society, the day might lean toward entertainment. The theater was a popular draw. Kabuki performances pulled crowds, even when censors disapproved. A samurai might slip into the audience, officially as a patron of culture, unofficially because he wanted to watch something outrageous and forget about rice stipends for a few hours. And if the kabuki didn't appeal, there were sumo matches, gambling dens, or steakhouses tucked in alleys where men argued louder than they should. Not every samurai was a refined poet. Some spent their day off drinking too much and leaving IOUs scrawled on tavern walls. The code of honor looked noble in scrolls. In practice, it sometimes looked like a man staggering home in full armor because he thought it made him harder to mug. And yet, even in these less refined pursuits, the class identity clung. A samurai could drink, but he drank with a certain ritual. He could gamble, but he gambled with an air of formality. He could watch kabuki, but he pretended it was cultural enrichment. A samurai's day off wasn't about freedom. It was about performing leisure correctly, keeping even relaxation within the lines. You never quite escaped the code, because the code wasn't just about swords. It was about being watched, always watched, by lords, by neighbors, by your own children learning how to imitate you. So imagine it now. A samurai kneeling in his small house, brush in hand, writing a stiff poem about autumn leaves. His wife is folding laundry, his children reciting characters. Outside, a merchant passes, already richer than the family inside. Later, the samurai might walk to the theater, sit stiffly while pretending to relax, laugh politely at jokes he shouldn't, then come home in the evening to trim a lamp and check his sword. That was a day off. That was rest. Not the absence of duty, but the performance of a different kind of duty, the duty to look composed, even in idleness. Not every samurai's day off looked like a tea ceremony balanced on a haiku. For every warrior kneeling politely over a bowl of matcha, there was another one sliding into a sake house with the posture of a man who had decided honor could wait until tomorrow morning. Because the truth is, samurai were people, and people on their days off often drift toward the same temptations. Drinking, gambling, lounging, and occasionally making choices that would horrify whatever moral handbook was currently making the rounds in the castle library. Let's start with drinking. Sake houses were the unofficial social hubs of downtime, where warriors, merchants, and whoever else had coins clinked together. The samurai liked to imagine they were dignified drinkers, savoring the ritual, bowing between cups, reciting a poem or two. In reality, by the third round, etiquette often dissolved into noisy arguments, bragging contests, and occasionally a fistfight that everyone pretended never happened the next day. Because what happens in the sake house, conveniently, stays in the sake house, unless of course a particularly loud retainer embarrassed himself so thoroughly that the story became the gossip of the week. You weren't supposed to lose your composure, but on days off, plenty did. Then there was gambling. Dice, cards, betting on sumo bouts, anything that could drain a stipend faster than a landlord. Officially, gambling was frowned upon. Unofficially, it was everywhere. Samurai, especially those at the lower end of the hierarchy with stipends that barely covered rice and sandals, often risked their coins hoping for a lucky break. And of course, most lost more than they won. Gambling houses thrived because of samurai optimism. They swaggered in with swords at their sides and left with empty purses, muttering excuses about how luck had betrayed them, as if dice cared about honor codes. But it wasn't just about the money. Gambling was a release, a way to feel in control of something, even if that control was an illusion. On a day off, the thrill of rolling dice could feel like a duel without consequences, until the rent was due. Bathhouses offered a cleaner diversion, though clean is relative when half the town is soaking in the same hot water. Still, they were important social spaces. On a day off, a samurai might spend hours there, not just bathing, but gossiping, listening, and watching. Information flowed through the steam faster than any official courier. Who was in debt, who had quarreled with their lord, who was secretly courting the daughter of a merchant. You could learn more in an afternoon at the bathhouse than from a week of formal reports. It was relaxation, yes, but also networking in a towel. You soaked, you sweated, you nodded at the right stories, and you left cleaner in body if not always in conscience. The theater was another indulgence. Kabuki, no, bunraku puppetry, each had its audience. Kabuki was flashy, colorful, scandalous, and of course the one that drew the most attention. Samurai weren't supposed to spend too much time there, because the censors were forever worried about corruption of morals, which is exactly why they went. Sitting stiffly in the cheap seats, they laughed at outrageous plots, admired the costumes, and pretended they weren't enjoying themselves as much as the merchants sitting 3 rows over. It was the kind of leisure that looked suspiciously like fun, which made it all the more irresistible. Of course, not every diversion was respectable. Samurai had reputations for visiting brothels, for losing themselves in red light districts, for doing things that scrolls and records politely gloss over. On their days off, some abandoned the performance of refinement altogether and simply indulged. It was risky, reputation mattered, after all, but people are people, and when you combine boredom, strict codes, and the stress of precarious stipends, indulgence was inevitable. The gap between the ideal samurai of the manuals and the real samurai of the streets was wide enough to march an army through. Still, most of these activities weren't about rebellion. They were about balance. You couldn't live under constant pressure, swords polished, posture rehearsed, poems written with perfect brushstrokes, without needing to let something slip. A day off wasn't really freedom, but it was a release valve. Whether through sake, dice, steam, or theater, samurai found ways to breathe outside the code. Some did it quietly, with dignity intact. Others did it loudly, with their dignity left behind in the bottom of a sake cup. Both were human. Both were samurai. So picture it now. A man in armor set aside, sleeves loosened, sitting in a crowded tavern with laughter spilling out into the night. His sword rests nearby, untouched. Dice rattle on the floor. Steam rises from the bathhouse down the street. In the theater, an actor stomps and poses, the crowd roaring approval. Somewhere, a clerk sharpens his brush for tomorrow's reports, already preparing to note who misbehaved. But tonight, the samurai is off duty. Tonight, he is not a paragon of virtue, or a figure in a scroll painting. He is simply a man on his day off, clinging to small pleasures, risking coins, sipping sake, and letting the rigid code loosen for just a while. Tomorrow the posture will return, the etiquette will tighten, the sword will shine again. But tonight, it is enough just to be. If a samurai's day off was about anything, it was rhythm. Not just the rhythm of sword drills and etiquette bows, but the rhythm of the seasons, because in Japan, the year itself told you how to spend your downtime. Festivals, rituals, blossoms, moons, all of them were opportunities for leisure that pretended not to be leisure, cultural obligations disguised as holidays. On paper, it was about honoring tradition. In practice, it was about giving yourself permission to relax without calling it relaxation. Spring was the most obvious example. When cherry blossoms bloomed, nobody stayed indoors. Samurai families, like everyone else, gathered under the trees to drink, to compose poems, to pretend they were meditating on the fleeting nature of life while also sneaking an extra cup of sake. Yes, there was a layer of philosophical depth. Blossoms fall quickly, life is impermanent, warriors must remember death is always near. But there was also the simple pleasure of sitting in a field, watching petals drift like confetti, and enjoying that for once, the beauty outside matched the poetry you were obligated to write. Samurai weren't immune to that soft pink magic. They took their day off under the trees, and for a brief time, the world felt lighter. Summer brought different rhythms. The heat was relentless, the nights heavy with buzzing insects, and the city smelled like sweat and smoke. On days off, samurai sought relief. Festivals filled the streets, drums echoing, lanterns glowing, processions moving slowly through crowded alleys. A warrior might wander with his family, eating grilled fish from a stall, watching fireworks burst over the river, pretending he wasn't just as dazzled as the children. Summer also meant shrine visits, where purification rituals offered a sense of renewal. You washed your hands, rang the bell, offered a prayer, and tried to feel cleaner in spirit if not in body. Leisure and devotion blurred together, because in the summer heat, both were about survival. Autumn was quieter, reflective. Moon viewing parties were popular, and yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, gathering to stare at the moon, sip sake, and compose melancholy poems about how beautiful the light was and how tragic it was that winter would soon arrive. It was cultural homework disguised as a party, and samurai leaned into it. The autumn moon became an excuse to stop worrying about ledgers, swords, and stipends, and to sit silently under silver light. For a class obsessed with control, it was one of the few times they could just watch the world without doing anything. And of course, afterward, someone read their haiku aloud, and everyone nodded gravely, pretending it wasn't the exact same poem written every year. Winter was different again. Cold seeped into wooden houses, snow-blanketed castle towns, and days off meant staying close to warmth. Families huddled by braziers, children chasing each other through misty breath, wives mending clothes with fingers stiff from the cold. For samurai, downtime in winter often meant storytelling, retelling tales of battles past, legends of heroes, moral lessons dressed up as entertainment. It was a way of passing long nights, of reminding everyone in the house that even in leisure, honor and duty were supposed to glow like embers. But behind the stories was a simpler truth. Families needed to pass the time, and stories were cheaper than firewood. Festivals punctuated all of this. New Year's was the biggest, filled with rituals for luck and longevity. Samurai bowed at shrines, exchanged gifts, and wrote their resolutions in neat calligraphy, as if writing be more virtuous on fine paper would magically make it happen. Boys' Day and Girls' Day brought out displays of armor or dolls, symbolic performances of identity and duty. Even these days off were reminders of roles, but they carried joy too. A boy unwrapping a toy sword, a girl admiring a lacquered doll, both already rehearsing the lives their society had assigned them. Leisure and obligation, bound together. And in between festivals, there was nature itself. Samurai on their days off walked gardens, admired chrysanthemums, sketched bamboo, or went hawking in crisp autumn air. The natural world wasn't just scenery, it was a stage for their leisure. Watching a falcon dive, watching a carp leap in a pond, watching snow fall on pine branches. Each was an acceptable way to spend free time without being accused of idleness. After all, appreciating beauty was a duty too. If you turned it into a poem afterward, it was practically work. So imagine it, a spring afternoon under cherry blossoms, petals drifting across a lacquer box, children chasing them while their father writes a stiff verse about mortality. Or a humid summer evening, lanterns glowing red over the river, a samurai eating grilled eel and pretending not to enjoy the fireworks too much. Or an autumn night, the moon bright as polished silver, a family huddled in silence, each person thinking their own thoughts but pretending the group mood is very profound. Or a winter morning, the house cold but alive with stories, the snow outside muting the city's noise. These were the days off, the pauses, the rituals that filled the spaces between duty. And in those rhythms, you see the truth. A samurai's life wasn't endless duels or constant service. It was seasons, festivals, gardens, tea, poems, and quiet walks. It was the same ordinary things everyone else did, dressed up in the armor of culture and etiquette. Because even warriors needed rest, and even rest needed rules. So here we are, at the end of the week, the end of the year, and really the end of the myth. Because when we talk about samurai, we usually think of duels at dawn, banners snapping in the wind, the clang of steel echoing across misty battlefields. The image is sharp, cinematic, heavy with honor and blood. But most samurai never lived in that picture. Their days were not one long fight. They were filled instead with the quiet details we've been walking through: tatami creaking, rice steaming, ink drying, tea whisking, dice rattling, sake pouring, children giggling, merchant smirking. Their swords were important, yes, but on most days those swords stayed sheathed. What they actually lived was a life of small duties and even smaller escapes. The day off is where the myth cracks and you see the person. You see a man polishing his blade because he has to, not because he plans to use it. You see a woman balancing the household books with the precision of a general leading troops, only her battlefield is the rice bin. You see a family kneeling under cherry blossoms, trying to look philosophical while swatting mosquitoes. You see a retainer at the theater, pretending he's there for cultural enrichment while laughing at slapstick in the cheap seats. You see a warrior in a bathhouse, gossiping in steam as if information soaks into the skin. You see the gap between the scroll paintings of perfect honor and the ordinary rhythm of real lives. And in that gap, there is something almost comforting. Because the samurai, for all their codes and their swords, were still human. They had debt. They had boredom. They had in-laws who visited too long, roofs that leaked, children who refused to study, neighbors who borrowed things and didn't return them. They had days when nothing much happened, when the biggest drama was whether the tea whisk foamed correctly. And those were the days that filled most of their lives. Days off weren't just breaks from duty. They were the bulk of existence. It's strange how history remembers the noise and forgets the quiet. We know the names of great battles, the lords, the shoguns, the rebels who rose and fell. But we don't remember the thousands of unnamed samurai who spent their afternoons writing bad poetry, or who huddled by a brazier in winter, or who quietly pawned their scabbard fittings to buy rice. And yet, those quiet lives were just as real, just as essential to the story. The samurai class wasn't built only on victories. It was built on patience, endurance, and the ability to keep the performance going, even on days when nothing heroic was required. So tonight, let's leave them there. Not on a battlefield, not locked in a duel, but in their homes and gardens, in taverns and bathhouses, under blossoms and moons. Let's leave them in the rhythm of their days off, where duty softened into ritual, and ritual softened into something like rest. The swords are sheathed. The armor is boxed. The tea is poured. The dice are rolling. The moon is rising. A samurai is off duty, for now, living a life that looks a lot more like ours than the myths suggest. And as you breathe slower, as your eyes get heavier, think of that world not as sharp or dramatic, but as quiet. Tatami underfoot, lantern light on the walls, the sound of children in the next room, the faint smell of rice in the air. A soft evening where nothing urgent waits, where tomorrow's duties can stay in tomorrow. Just an ordinary night in an ordinary house, lived by someone whose life was remembered in legend but lived in small, human moments. The samurai's day off. Nothing grand. Nothing heroic. Just enough. And with that, it's time to rest.